Okay, so this first pattern we're going to tie is a Callibaetis Nymph. This is a pattern I use a lot in the early season, and it's tied with a biot, it's tied with some whiting schlappen, and I'm going to introduce a number of different whiting products tonight as I tie through the various patterns in the Callibaetis life cycle. The very first one will be schlappen. And schlappen is a long, webby feather behind the saddle hackle, but before the tail. And you can see the characteristics of this hackle. It's a nice long hackle. And it's very, very webby, almost entirely webby. And I like this because of that web for my mayfly nymphs. So I'm going to use this for the tail. We'll use it down toward the bottom where I get a little fluffy feathers. And then we'll use it for the legs as we tie this pattern. So let's go ahead and get started on this pattern. This is my little Callibaetis Nymph, one I like a lot. I'll often hang this under a strike indicator and do short little pulls, maybe 6-inch little strips with it, and so on and so forth. I'm going to start this fly with about 6 or 7 wraps of a non-toxic lead wire, or not lead, but a non-toxic wire. And one thing I want you to note as I'm tying this, I pinch the wire with the tag ends facing upwards. And what that basically does is it gives me a full half wrap in the front and a half wrap in the back of this pattern. I can take my scissors and smooth out that wire just slightly, and then I'm going to cover it up a little bit. Now for the tail on this pattern, I'm going to reach into my whiting schlappen, and you see this soft stuff right down toward the very base of the feather. I'm going to strip off some of that material for my tail. I like that little soft material for a tail on a nymph because it the Callibaetis mayfly has very substantial gill structure, and this helps create the image of that gill structure to some extent. And so we'll tie that on right at the tail set position. I like to pre-cut a lot of my materials. I want to tie this on right behind the wire and start getting rid of that goiter I've established with that wire. And so I'm going to tie that on right behind it and wind back up to the base. So the next material I'm going to use is some bronze wire. This is a biot pattern, and I like to add some strength and stability to biots when I tie them on a fly. And so I'm going to tie on some wire which we'll use to wrap over my biot when I tie that in. So moving right along, I'm going to take the Spirit River turkey that I showed you earlier, and I'm going to tie this in with the leading edge of that biot facing forward and the trailing edge facing backwards. Now the very first wrap I take with this material, it's going to fold on me, so the leading edge will be backwards and the trailing edge forwards. You can look at it from the perspective one side is opaque and one side is more translucent. The more translucent side may have a little notch on it. And so you can see how that folded over. And now, as I wind this forward, I've got some very nice segmentation appearing in this pattern. And I'm going to wind it all the way up to and onto that thorax area. And then I'm going to tie it off by winding over the top of that biot first, right where it's supported on the hook itself. If I cross my thread against this biot, it acts as a razor blade, and it'll cut that biot right off, and so I can avoid that particular issue just by tying right on top of the hook as I lay it onto the biot itself. Now I brought this bronze wire, and this is where I'm adding strength to that biot, and see I'm following the path of the biot real close to that segment, and this is doing two things for me. It is adding strength to the biot. It'll break very easy in trout teeth, and so I want my flies to last more than one trout, hopefully a whole bunch of trout. And also we want the segmentation that really emphasizes, and you can see that in the picture. So next I'm going to move into my turkey tail, and you see that sheen on the upper part of that turkey tail. It's really got a lot of natural flashback to it. Well, I'm going to take advantage of that for my wing case on this pattern. And so I'm going to clip that off, or clip off a section of that turkey tail, and I'll tie it in with that shiny side facing backward and the dull side facing forward. And then when I fold it over to create the wing case, that flashback or that shiny area will come through. Now I also mentioned that I'm using a blend of superfine and a UV Callibaetis dubbing. And so I take and felt out about 75% of the superfine and a few fibers of the UV to use for the thorax of this pattern. I tie UV in an awful lot of my mayfly patterns. It just adds that life signature that we're looking for. And I'm going to start that right up at the very front of that thorax. And then I'm going to spin that and create a yarn and hang on to it so it's nice and tight on my thread. And so I'll spin that all the way, and then I can wind back toward the front of the pattern. And so that'll create my thorax. Now I mentioned earlier, I showed you a picture of our schlappen. Now I've taken my schlappen and I've trimmed off a little wedge of it. You can see that on the piece that I've got holding up here. And so that's going to form the legs on this pattern. And I'm using the stem of the schlappen to basically hold that in place. So I can take that schlappen and set it down on either side to form the legs on this pattern, and then I can reach in and tie that real tightly against the hump on this fly and get those legs to splay out on either side of the pattern nicely for me. And I'll trim off the excess and clean up that head just a little bit. Tying live with a macro lens is a risky proposition because this macro lens shows off all the imperfections in your fly patterns. But that's okay. The next, I've taken that flashback and I folded it over. And I'll trim that off. And then I'll clean up this head just slightly. And I'm going to drop into a whip finish. And so that's our almost finished Callibaetis mayfly. I tied that off with a whip finish just using my fingers. I never learned how to use a whip finish tool. And so I just tie it off very quickly with 2 whip finishes, and that'll never come loose. So the very last step is to seal that wing case with some UV resin. I'm using Solara's Bone Dry, and it's a really good material for this particular pattern. And I'll go ahead and cure that with my UV light for a few seconds. And then let's spin this around in the vise so you can get a chance to see the Callibaetis nymph. That dark wing case, as mayflies emerge, very often the wing case for mayflies darkens up, and that's the reason we use that very dark color on the wing case. And so that's a good tip as you're tying your mayfly nymphs, and in this case, Callibaetis mayfly nymph. The next pattern in our series will be the soft hackle, so tune in to that video. Thanks for watching.